This is take two of Susan Ní Chríodáin and myself going live. I'm not really sure what happened the first time. When I look on LinkedIn, it still says it's waiting to broadcast, although I was on StreamYard and I was broadcasting live. We had a conversation for about 2.5 minutes and I can't see it anywhere. So apologies for anyone who watched that initial conversation. We are here today talking about psychological safety at work and what that means. We had a really, really great conversation and quite a lengthy conversation covering lots of topics on the most recent Happier at Work podcast, which came out on Friday last week. So I thought before we dive into talking about the podcast and some of the key topics that we covered there, maybe Susan, you want to tell people a little bit about yourself and your background.
Thanks, Aoife. Yeah. So I'm Susan Ní Chríodáin and I have a business called Beyond the Numbers. And the idea is to work with organizations who want to implement strategies to help them put their people first, because they know that by putting people first, they will generate the greatest returns. And often that's working with teams or individuals or perhaps throughout the full organization, depending on the requirements.
I can totally get behind that message, Susan. Anyway, and it would be remiss of me not to mention Helen Joy, who actually connected us. So Helen was a previous guest on the podcast. We had a great episode talking about first-time managers. And then Helen connected us. We had a wonderful conversation offline or like separate to the podcast, and then recorded this podcast episode. So it's all about psychological safety. I suppose maybe what we can talk about initially is like, well, what does that mean? What does that actually look like?
Well, I think like we did in the podcast, it's almost easiest to think about family life first. So, you know, if you're a kid in a household or when you grew up in a household, hopefully you felt free enough to be yourself and involved your parents in what was going on in your life. And, you know, and everybody felt safe in the family or in school. So you were in school and hopefully you felt safe to have good interactions with your teachers. And by safe, I mean that actually you don't, by saying something, answering a question or asking a question, you don't feel like you're going to be reprimanded for it or there's going to be some negative consequences.
Well, certainly, Susan, if I think of school and the bullying that goes on and the laughing if you get an answer wrong and all that sort of stuff, maybe not every school or any school, I'm not sure, is necessarily a psychologically safe environment. But I think it's a really interesting way of describing it, like what psychological safety actually means. It's feeling safe enough to actually speak up for yourself, to challenge the boss maybe. And that's something that we definitely spoke about on the podcast, where it's, you know, oftentimes if someone is the leader, brilliant, Sinead is... Sinead is tuning in, so we definitely know that we're live this time around. Sinead, I'm not sure if you saw the earlier version of this live, but this is take two, let's just say. So thanks for tuning in live. Now I've completely lost my chain of thought. This is the beauty of going live, isn't it?
You were talking about challenging the boss.
Yeah, the leader, yeah.
I don't even know if it has to be challenge, Aoife. It can just be a normal meeting where you're sitting in a meeting and you think my opinion doesn't matter. Exactly. Or if I speak up, people might laugh at me or people might scorn me or mock me or whatever.
This is it, yeah.
And it's more... That's horrible.
Yeah, it's more, I suppose when I say challenge, I mean, not that it is a challenge, but more challenge the status quo. So if the boss tells you to do something and you do it unquestioningly, that you just kind of go along with it because that's what the boss said, rather than kind of using a bit of initiative and saying, well, is this really the right thing to do? Or could we find a better way to do this? Then it's, you know, it's that you're safe to do that. You're safe to take risks. You're safe to fail at work, and it's okay. And I hate that term failure. But you're in an environment where you're safe to actually do that and to challenge how things are currently being done. Because I know oftentimes it's a case of, well, we've always done it that way. And so that's why we're doing it. You know, we're doing it this way because that's the way it's always been done. And I know certainly I have worked in organizations. Pauline is tuning in live as well. That's brilliant. Yeah, so like Susan, like there's some specific things that we spoke about on the podcast. I have my notes here in front of me just as a prompt, but people are afraid to say what's on their mind. Like that's the kind of the key thing. So if people are not actually speaking up.
Yeah, I think that is a key thing. And yeah, it's not even speaking out as much as just speaking up or offering your opinion or being okay to say, I don't know, or I don't understand, or can you explain it to me another way? Because that's something else. You know, you get an instruction barked at you or maybe even said nicely to you. And you feel like if I ask here for clarification, that it's going to reflect badly on me. So I'll go away and pretend I know what I'm doing and then, you know, suffer for a bunch of hours while you faff about trying to figure it out, getting stressed, and instead of just saying, I don't understand.
Well, this is it. And I think like the issue with, I think, not every leader, but with some leaders, that they don't necessarily understand that power differential that's going on. So if they tell someone to do something, they often take it as like, that's a given, that's what I have to do, that's what I'm supposed to do, without really thinking, without really challenging whether it's the right thing to do. And the leaders perceive that they've created this wonderful, safe environment when in fact actually the opposite is true.
Yeah. And I think, you know, Amy Edmondson, who talks about psychological safety all the time, you know, she makes a really good example about if you're in a hospital or in a, and a doctor says, give somebody this dose, and the nurse realizes that the dose is incorrect. But because the last time she said something to the doctor, he bit her head off, she decides, oh, well, he's probably got it right. And then the patient suffers. And that's a really interesting way of looking at it. You know, luckily, most of us are not in life and death situations all the time, which means, God, if you can't speak up then, you know, like go ahead and say something, because it's better for everyone.
Interestingly, that exact that anecdote came up in a podcast that has been recorded, but it hasn't been released yet. It is a life or death situation, and you know, that's when psychological safety is its most critical, because someone might die if you don't actually make that recommendation, or if you don't change, or if you don't challenge what's going on. So I think that's really, really important. I think bringing it back down to non-life or death situations, maybe it's like we spoke about this concept of positive conflict. Like oftentimes we perceive conflict as something really difficult at work and something really challenging, but I think it's important to embrace that sense of positive conflict where things are being challenged. And something I know we spoke about on the podcast a lot is this idea of innovation. And if there's that sense of positive conflict in the workplace, then it drives innovation and helps us to improve. It helps us to do things in a better and more efficient and more effective way.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like all of us probably know what it feels like to feel nervous or afraid to say something. And if you're feeling like that, how on earth can you innovate or be creative or think outside the box? Because all you're really doing is trying to protect yourself, and you're going to stay safe and small. But once it's open and it's okay for you to kind of encourage wild ideas and just get on with things. And that's where like design thinking is a wonderful way of innovating and thinking like that, and encouraging people to come out with wild ideas. But if you've got somebody judging you all the time, you're not going to innovate. Yeah.
I know, certainly, actually, just a thought has occurred to me of when I was a new joiner of an organization, and I had a really great, I'll retract that statement. I had an idea. I don't know how great it was, but I did have an idea of how things might be done differently. And I was coming to this with a lot of global experience, you know, quite a good chunk of experience behind me. And I made that suggestion, and this wasn't to a boss, it wasn't to a leader, this was to one of my colleagues. And I received the message loud and clear, that's not how we do things around here. And I thought, wow. And I also thought, I'm never, ever sharing an idea again. Do you know, like it's such, it's so detrimental to, you know, and I'm not saying it was the best idea in the world, but I suppose for me, it was just an opportunity to do things in a different way and to bring that experience that I had with me to try and maybe do things differently.
But ideas are there to build on as well, Aoife. Like, you know, you don't have to come out with the best idea straight away. I mean, but if everybody feels comfortable, and that's where the challenging the idea, debating it, and having fun around it, but also building on it, you probably come to a great, fantastic idea. But if you're told, oh no, we don't do things like that around here, well, what are you going to do? Look for another job or just stay quiet?
And interestingly, Susan, I've often heard culture being described as that's how we do things around here. And like, to be told that's not how we do things around here, I was like, okay, message received loud and clear. You know, I won't be sharing any more of those wild ideas ever again.
But what was that culture then, Aoife? Because that culture was keep quiet culture, or we want to stay where we are. We're not interested in
how things have always been done, and let's continue to do them as they've always been done. Because that's. Did
you stay?
Well, obviously not, because now I have.
But you might have stayed 5 years.
That's as much as I'll say on that. And if anyone does want to reach out to me separately about that, I'm happy to discuss in private, let's say. But Susan, another thing that we spoke about was having difficult conversations, and that ties in a little bit with this idea of psychological safety. And I know, like, having difficult conversations at work is, by its very nature, it's difficult. So whether that's a redundancy conversation, whether it's talking about some personal aspects within what's going on for you, any thoughts on how to handle those types of situations?
Well, I think it's you know, what we talk about is the preparation, I suppose, and realizing that you've got a human being sitting across from you, just like we are today, and that if you, instead of thinking about yourself and how difficult it is for you, think about the person across from you and how you can make that conversation as reasonable and rational as possible. And I suppose becoming comfortable with the fact that you do feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that actually that's a good thing, because if you don't feel a bit iffy about it, you're not really tapping into the human side of yourself.
Human. Yeah.
You know, we can get a robot to come in the room and do the conversation.
And deliver the message. Yeah.
And I suppose
like
rather than
human level.
And then also allowing that person the space and the place to talk and to get what they need off their chest. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everything or pussyfoot around them, but don't try to prove you're right, or don't try to make it about you. Make it very much about the other person.
Yeah. Interestingly, when I talk about imposter syndrome, that's one of the key elements to it as well, is it's not about you and your own, you know, insecurities and you're not showing up for yourself. It's about showing up for the other people who are there, the people who you're there to serve. And when imposter syndrome gets in the way of that, then we let other people down who we're there to serve. So get out of your own way, essentially, and show up for the other person. So it's really interesting that you talk about that. A shout out to Pauline. She's saying in the comments that she's considering doing something around miscarriage support in the workplace for her master's and psychological safety in that space. I think that's a really, really important thing. And I've seen that I won't say on many times, but I have seen it more than I have ever previously on the likes of the forums, you know, the likes of LinkedIn, which you would never see that kind of thing previously, I think. So it's really great to see that sort of stuff.
And I mean, menopause is a big issue as well at the moment. I think that it's being talked about. I know it's even being talked about in Ireland a lot. It's certainly being talked about in the UK a lot.
It was on Talk to Joe Duffy.
Yeah,
a brand new phone line. Yeah, just to deal with it. But
and a lot of women talk about being able to talk about it at work. And I think it is a workplace issue, and it doesn't impact only women, it impacts everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, if you can feel safe to have that conversation, then you can be yourself at work and show up at your best.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is it. And kind of work when you are working to your best. And Sinead is saying fresh eyes bring perspective and it's critical to growth. New ideas are gold. Sinead, I 100% agree with you. And I'm still obviously reeling from that experience at work where I was told that's not how we do things around here. So, yeah,
but that's a sign to run for the door.
Oh yeah, it should have been. It should have been. It really should. But no, I didn't immediately leave. Like, I mean, I was done fresh in the door at that stage. But certainly, it showed a lot of what the culture was like.
And I think if you can have these conversations at interview stage, if you can suss people out at interview stage to feel like, well, if I say something a little controversial or not. How will it be received? How did the interviewers interact with one another? Do they seem like they have a safe relationship?
That's a really, really great point. I think from a candidate's perspective, like assessing in advance of these things happening, or you know, the interview really is a two-way process. You should be assessing whether that's the right company for you to join. Absolutely. Now, I was going to say that, is there anything else that you'd like to share based on the podcast? It was out on Friday. It won't be under this link because this is a new post because for whatever reason, the first one wasn't broadcast. But once we're finished doing this live, I'll put a link to the full podcast for anyone who wants to check that out. And the other thing, so anything else that you'd like to say?
Well, I suppose I listened back to it, Aoife, and it's always interesting listening back to something because you're going, wow, I managed to say that. Amazing. But one thing I really liked was data dissolves difficulty.
Yeah.
And we were talking about how once you are going into a difficult conversation, for example, if you have the evidence and the data to back up what you want to talk about, it actually makes having a conversation much easier, as opposed to just going in and kind of vaguely talking around things you've noticed. So one thing I always say to people is try and keep a record, keep the data of where things are going wrong so that you can use it later as evidence. Yeah. And of course, I have to plug my own podcast as well, because Aoife's been a guest on Life Beyond the Numbers. We did an episode called Happier at Work, or Happy at Work, I think. And so I have a podcast where we talk about how to have a more fulfilling work life. So would love for people to come and listen to that too.
Yeah. No, and I've listened to a few episodes recently, and I think like it's the kind of conversations that you have and the range of guests that you have is really, really great as well. So thank you for continuing to do that, Susan. It's really great. I suppose a couple of updates from me. I now have a Patreon account, and you know, it's a little bit scary talking about those kind of things on LinkedIn, but let's talk about psychological safety. And I'm bringing my full self now. I've set up a Patreon account. I'll put a link to that below as well. So there's 3 different levels on it, and it's a way of supporting the podcast. Obviously, I do it out of my own time. I've recently hired an editor who does all the sound editing for me and the notes and all of that kind of stuff as well. And that's an investment of time and money. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I did run a survey. It's still open at the moment, but I'm going to close it, I think, this afternoon on well-being at work and how it relates to engagement. And I plan to work on the results of that survey and analysing that and sharing it. So if anyone is interested in seeing the results of that, then please do get in touch with me. It's looking at very much from the employee's perspective, the results will be, but the recommendations and the insights from it. And I will be demonstrating what you can do with data as well. So if you're not sure exactly what you can do with surveys, and it's not just going to be reams of reporting and metrics and data, it's going to actually be insights and recommendations. So if you do want that, then feel free to reach out to me as well. Or if you want to know how I could work with you in that capacity, then absolutely feel free to reach out to me. Anything else? Thanks, Pauline. She's saying great idea with the Patreon. Yeah, it took me long enough, but I think I've filled up enough of an established amount of podcast content now that I feel that it's a bit easier to do that. And Sinead is saying as well, it's great that the topic of menopause is now being discussed at work. So yeah, absolutely 100% agree. And maybe it's something that I will talk about on the podcast at some stage as well. I haven't, not to get too personal, I haven't reached that stage, but I know that I'm heading into that territory soon enough. So
well, I have, and I've been through it, and I'm on the other side, and I'll tell you, it needs to be talked about.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and no better people. Project Alone, be amazing to see supported by your new Patreon account. Thank you. Thanks so much, Sinead. Anyway, thank you to everyone who has tuned in live. If you're watching on the replay, let us know. Do #replay in the comments. And as I mentioned, I'll put the link to the full podcast episode below and the link to my Patreon account below as well for anyone who would like to support the podcast. And thank you so much for getting involved in the conversation.
And thank you, Aoife, for inviting me here today and having me on your podcast. And best of luck. I'll be dying to hear how it's going.
Thank you.